My name is Nora Callen, 70 years old this spring. I've spent most of my life in Charlottesville, where the courthouse sits on a quiet corner of East High Street brick, solemn and too bright in the morning light. I worked for the city's finance department for 32 years. Numbers made sense to me, people less so. I retired 5 years ago, not because I was tired, but because I thought I'd finally earned some peace. Today, that peace feels like a story I once read and forgot the ending to. The corridor smelled of lemon polish and paper. My heels clicked once, twice, echoing longer than they should. I adjusted my coat and gripped my old leather bag of habit from years of audits and briefings, though now it carried only tissues, reading glasses, and a folder with my name typed neatly on the label. When I stepped into the courtroom, my daughter Ilara turned first. Her husband Grant leaned toward her, whispering something that made her smile without warmth. Then came that look, half amusement, half pity, as if I were the guest who had wandered into the wrong room. The bailiff called. Case number 3, Callen versus Callen. The name sounded heavier than it looked on paper. I walked to the defendant's table. The wood was cold beneath my fingertips. Grant kept his eyes on the judge's bench. A picture of composure. Ilara folded her hands. Nails painted the same deep red she'd worn since college. Judge Lansing adjusted his glasses and began flipping through the file. The shuffle of pages filled the silence until it stopped. His brow furrowed. He turned one page back, then forward again, and finally looked up. Wait, he said slowly. She's the one you're suing. No one answered. Even the clerk's typing paused. The air thinned. I heard my own pulse. The faint tick of the wall clock. The sound of something invisible breaking between us. I didn't move. Years of board meetings had trained me to keep my expression steady, but my fingers trembled beneath the table. Judge Lansing closed the file. We'll begin with the petition summary. And just like that, the life I'd built every hour, every choice sat on trial between my daughter's silence and a stack of papers that bore my name. It had started quietly. Weeks before the hearing, just an envelope waiting on my porch. The paper was heavy. The label typed in neat black font, Mrs. Nora Callen, no return address. I assumed it was a bank update or some leftover city paperwork. Though the weight of it felt wrong in my hand, inside, the letter was polite in that way only lawyers can manage paragraphs of formality wrapped around something cold. Concerns regarding the management of estate assets. Consideration for oversight to ensure continued financial safety. The sentences blurred together, full of words I had used myself in another lifetime. Oversight, evaluation, concern. I'd written those same phrases to protect taxpayers, not to threaten a mother. I folded it neatly, pressed the crease with my thumb, and left it on the kitchen counter beside the teapot. For a day, I convinced myself it was an error, but the second letter came. Firmer this time, signed by someone named Harlan Vick, attorney at law, referencing diminished capacity and suggesting a medical review. I read it 3 times before the meaning sank in. My name sat there like a diagnosis. That night, I couldn't bring myself to turn off the kitchen light. The kettle hissed, steam curling against the window, but I never poured the tea. I sat at the table instead, surrounded by the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick of the wall clock. It was the kind of silence that made you question what you missed. What small moment turned love into litigation? The third envelope arrived the following week, thicker, stapled, official. Petition for conservatorship of Nora M. Callen. The words looked surgical, without blood or hesitation. Below, in bold, petitioner Ilara Vance. I read the name twice. My hand tightened around the page until the edge cut my skin. Then I set it down, flat and careful, like something that might shatter The whistle of the kettle rose again behind me, sharp and insistent. But I didn't move. I simply watched the steam fade against the glass until the world outside disappeared. After the third letter, I stopped pretending it would go away. The envelope still sat on the kitchen counter, but my mind drifted somewhere further back to the years when paper had meant something different. Bills, receipts, enrollment forms, each one proof that I was building a life, not defending it. When Harold died, I was 39, the day after the funeral. I sold his car to cover the mortgage and took a night shift at the university hospital, filing patient records. By day, I worked in the city's finance department, tracking budgets for projects that never quite balanced. I used to joke that numbers were the only things that kept their promises. Ilara was 10 then, quiet and curious, with the same steady hands her father had. Every birthday, I baked her a small lemon cake. Every spring, I sent her to science camp even if it meant tuna sandwiches for me all week. By the time she went to college, I had 2 ledgers, one for work and one for home. The first was for the city, the second, for love. That second ledger was my anchor. Each line neat and dated tuition payments, car insurance, co-pays, field trips, Christmas airfare. The pages smelled faintly of pencil lead and detergent. I wrote everything down, not to remember sacrifice, but to prove that life, even when thin, could still add up. When she graduated, I stood in the auditorium balcony and thought, I did it. Not perfectly, but enough. I never remarried, never moved, never took more than I earned. I trusted that what I built through math and patience would last longer than grief. Now, decades later, that same daughter questions my capacity to manage numbers, as if 32 years of balancing the city's accounts and raising her on my own had dissolved into confusion. I ran my hand over the ledger's worn cover. The ink had faded, but the arithmetic still held. Love, after all, had always been measured in what one quietly subtracts. 3 months before the first envelope arrived, Grant stopped by one Sunday morning. He'd brought a bakery box blueberry muffins, the kind Ilara never ate but always bought when she wanted to look thoughtful. He smiled easily, in that practiced way of people who make their living convincing others they're helping. "Mom," he said, setting down the box, "Ilara's worried about your files. You've got so many paper records, tax forms, deeds, all that. I can digitize them for you. Safer that way, in case anything ever happens." I hesitated. The word safer always has a shadow behind it. Still, I let him follow me to the study. "Copies only," I said, more than once. He nodded, polite, already sliding a flash drive into my printer's port. I watched him move through my desk drawers, scanning IDs, trust deeds, power of attorney forms, even the insurance folder Harold and I kept since our first mortgage. He worked quickly, confident, humming under his breath. When I brought tea, he'd labeled every folder in neat digital order, efficient, almost admirable. Before leaving, he promised to email me everything that evening. He never did. At first, I forgot about it. I forgot. The days were mild, the house quiet, and the scanner's hum faded into memory. But weeks later, my bank sent an alert: "New authorized user added to your profile." My stomach tightened. I hadn't added anyone. I called the branch the next morning. The representative's voice was cautious, professional. "It lists you as the approving signatory. Mrs. Callen, the document we have on file includes your license and a durable power of attorney." She emailed me a copy. I printed it, laid it beside my checkbook. The signature looked almost perfect, same slant, same looped R, but the pressure was off, like someone tracing over a memory. It was my name, but it didn't belong to me. I stared at the page until the ink seemed to waver. Then I slid it into my folder, next to the others. The air in the room felt thinner, like the house itself was holding its breath. I didn't call the bank again. Instead, I went to the study and pulled the fireproof box from beneath the desk. It had followed me through every move and storm, heavy as a secret. Inside were the bones of my life passports, Harold's death certificate, the deed to the house, the will, the trust documents I'd revised a decade ago. Everything was where it should be except one page. The divider labeled legal had shifted forward, and a single sheet was missing from the middle of the trust folder. I didn't have to guess which one. It was the amendment that protected the house from outside claims, the clause that ensured it would stay under my sole ownership unless I chose otherwise. The box was clean, undisturbed. Whoever had opened it knew what they were looking for. I sat down at the desk and reread the petition line by line. This time, slower. Liquidation of jointly influenced property for equitable redistribution. The phrasing was clever Grant's work, no doubt. He'd always been fond of language that sounded generous while hollowing meaning from the inside out. Jointly influenced property. They meant the house. My home. The walls around me seemed to shrink. I thought of the mornings spent patching the roof myself. The summer I repainted the porch. The years of refinancing just enough to help Alara buy her own place without losing mine. This house had outlived every version of me, wife, widow, mother, and somehow they wanted to reduce it to a divisible asset. I smoothed the papers, aligning their edges against the table. My thumb brushed the margin where Harold's signature once sat. Steady and alive. For the first time in years, my eyes stung. One tear fell onto the page, spreading the ink in a slow gray bloom. I pressed the sheet flat again, carefully, as if fixing it could keep the past intact. Then I closed the box, turned the key, and felt the click echo through the room, soft, final, and colder than metal had any right to be. 2 days after finding the missing page, I called Martin Havelock. His number was still written inside the old address book I kept by the phone, a fading ink entry from when Harold and I first drew up our wills. Martin had been a young attorney then, patient and exacting, the kind who never filled a silence unless it mattered. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Callen," he said, his voice older now, but steady. I told him what had happened, the forged signature, the missing clause, the petition. When I finished, he didn't interrupt or reassure. He just exhaled quietly and said, "Bring everything, originals only." That afternoon, I carried the fireproof box to his office on 3rd Street. The place smelled of leather and dust, a comfortingly human scent. Martin read each page, adjusting his glasses, the rhythm of his pen tapping against the desk. When he looked up, his eyes were kind but sharp. "They won't expect you to have documentation. You always did your own record keeping. I kept everything." I said, "I always have." He nodded once, then opened a legal pad and began listing what we'd submit to the court. Under Property Deeds and Trust Amendment, I added my own small line ledger archive. The binder was navy blue, its spine frayed, the label handwritten in faded ink. Inside were decades of neat proof tax filings, notarized correspondence, pension statements, even a medical evaluation from last year certifying I was of sound mind. Each section was dated, numbered, cross-referenced. Order had been my defense long before this day. At the very back, taped inside the cover, was a small silver flash drive. I'd almost forgotten it. The footage from my home security camera recorded the day Grant had helped me digitize the files was still stored there. I closed the binder. The sound soft but absolute. For the first time since the letters began, the weight in my chest shifted, not gone, but balanced. There was a kind of power in paper, if you kept it long enough. The second hearing began under pale winter light. The courtroom felt smaller this time, the air thick with the sound of papers shuffling and polite voices measuring words. Ilara's lawyer, a young man with polished shoes and a voice smooth as glass, opened with phrases designed to sound merciful. "This isn't about punishment," he said. "It's about concern, a family's wish to ensure safety and proper management." I kept my eyes on the grain of the table. Martin had told me to let them speak first. "They'll overreach," he'd said. Polish always cracks under its own shine. Across the aisle, Ilara nodded on cue, her hands folded neatly, her expression somewhere between pity and resolve. Grant stared straight ahead, jaw tight. To anyone else? They looked like children carrying out a painful duty. When the attorney finished, Martin stood. His voice carried none of the lawyer's theatrical ease, just clarity. "Your Honor, the respondent requests a private conference under Rule 45, concerning protected medical and financial documents submitted without verified consent." Judge Lansing's head lifted. He adjusted his glasses, eyes narrowing slightly as he studied me for the first time that morning. "Mrs. Callen," he said slowly, "you worked in city finance, didn't you?" I blinked, startled. "Yes, Your Honor." 32 years? He leaned back, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his mouth. "I thought so. I remember you from probate court, under Judge Riley. Your husband's estate, Harold Callen." "Correct." My breath caught. The memory surfaced Ilara at 8 years old, sitting beside me, coloring spaceships in the margins of the forms while I signed papers confirming ownership of the house. The silence in the courtroom deepened. Even Ilara glanced up, confusion crossing her face. Judge Lansing closed the folder before him and looked toward both attorneys. "Let's recess for 10 minutes, he said. "Counsel Chambers, please." The gavel's soft knock echoed through the room. For the first time, I saw the certainty on my daughter's face begin to tremble. When we reconvened, the air in the courtroom felt different, quiet, expectant, as if even the walls knew something was about to break. Judge Lansing gestured for Martin to proceed. My lawyer rose, the blue binder in his hands, the same binder I had carried for decades, edges worn smooth by habit and patience. He laid it on the evidence table and opened it without introduction. The first pages were routine tax filings, notarized affidavits, annual medical evaluations. Everyone signed, dated, and sealed. He spoke little, letting the documents speak for themselves. The court clerk leaned forward, eyes widening at the sheer order of it. Then came the access log's dates, times, IP addresses tied to Grant's laptop, each showing unauthorized entry into my bank account. Martin's tone stayed calm. Each line corresponds to a login during Mr. Vance's visit to Mrs. Callen's home. The lawyer representing Ilara tried to interrupt, but Judge Lansing lifted a hand. Let him continue. Martin turned another page, revealing the notarized health letter from my physician, signed 2 months before the supposed evaluation in their petition. Mrs. Callen was and remains of full cognitive and financial capacity, it read. Finally, Martin pressed a key on the court's display monitor. The screen flickered, then steadied. The footage was grainy but clear. Grant standing in my study, my driver's license on the scanner, his phone to his ear. "Yeah, I'll get it done today," his voice murmured faintly. No one moved. The silence was thicker than outrage. Judge Lansing leaned back slowly, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Ilara's face drained of color, her lips parted, then closed again without sound. Grant's posture folded inward. The attorney beside them stared at his notes as if they'd turned to dust. Martin closed the binder, its clasp snapping softly in the stillness. My hands remained folded in my lap. When the judge looked at me, I met his gaze and spoke evenly, my voice steady in the hollow quiet. I told you I kept everything. The final session began without ceremony. Judge Lansing entered, robe edges trailing like dusk against the polished floor. No one spoke. Even the air seemed reluctant to move. I sat at the same table where I had first heard my name spoken as a case number. The difference now was weight, not the heaviness of fear, but the solidity of something that could finally stand on its own. He cleared his throat and began reading. Voice even, deliberate. The court finds no credible basis for the petition of conservatorship filed against Mrs. Nora M. Callen. The claims of diminished capacity and financial mismanagement are without merit. Accordingly, the case is dismissed with prejudice. The words landed quietly, like stones in water. For a moment, no one moved. Then he continued, tone cooling to something procedural yet unmistakably sharp. Furthermore, given evidence presented of unauthorized access, document falsification, and forged identification, this court recommends referral to the Commonwealth Attorney's Office for review of potential fraud. Across the aisle, Grant's shoulders sagged. Ilara turned toward me, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. Mom, please. The word was half apology, half disbelief. I rose, buttoned my coat, and gathered my folder. My chair scraped softly against the floor. I didn't look at her, not out of anger, but because I couldn't bear to watch her flinch. The clerk began to collect the exhibits. The gavel struck once, a final, merciful sound. Outside, the cold air cut clean against my skin. The winter sunlight reflected off the courthouse steps, sharp and white, as though the world itself had been wiped down and reset. Martin followed behind me, holding the binder like something sacred. He didn't speak, and neither did I. There was nothing left to explain. Our footsteps echoed on the stone, slow and sure, each one carrying us further from the voices inside and closer to the kind of silence that no longer hurt, only held. Weeks passed before I opened the door to my study again. The air smelled of paper and dust, familiar and undemanding. Stacks of documents still lined the table, each marked with yellow tabs from the trial. I took them one by one, shredding duplicates, boxing evidence, keeping only what mattered, the originals that had carried me through. The act was slow, methodical. Every rustle of paper sounded like breath, returning to a room that had been holding it too long. I didn't feel triumphant, just clean, as if the house itself had exhaled. When the last box was sealed, I turned to the old navy ledger on the corner of the desk. Its spine was cracked, the cover dulled to soft cloth. I opened it carefully. The pages still scented faintly of graphite and soap. There it was, the story of my life in numbers: tuition checks, field trip fees, loan payments for Ilara's first car, grocery money rounded to the cent, the quiet arithmetic of survival. I traced the handwriting, the way my pen had looped with certainty even when money was thin. The ink told more truth than memory ever could. Every entry was a promise kept. Every line was love, translated into math. I turned to the last blank page, pen in hand, but left it untouched. There was no need to record the court case, no column wide enough for betrayal or repair. Some things didn't belong to accounting, they belonged to silence. The phone rang once, twice, an unknown number flashing on the screen. I let it ring out. The house was still, the late light softening across the floor. I stood by the window and watched the sun move over the brass plaque newly fixed beside my door. The letters caught the glow, quiet but clear, home by consent only. I rested my hand against the glass and whispered to the empty room, Let silence finish what truth began.